All right. Again, for those of you joining us, welcome. We do have the YouTube feed going, so people can watch that way as well. For those who are not joining via the Zoom meeting, so the YouTube is up and going. Welcome. We do have the YouTube. And I just clicked something on the YouTube. Let me fix that.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
All right.
Hey, this is Coach Bauer from Gainesville High. I'm sitting in for Keith Watts. I'm a co-chair of our school advisory council.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to mute myself and I'll unmute myself to speak.
Thank you. No problem.
This is Gunnar Paulson.
Yes, sir.
I coached both of his brothers.
How you doing, Coach?
Good, I'm doing good. You doing all right?
Neil there.
Yep.
Doing great. Living the dream every day. Nobody in here. All right.
Yes, sir.
I coached both of his brothers.
How you doing, Coach?
Good, I'm doing good. You doing all right?
Neil there. Doing great. Living the dream every day.
Looks like Dr. McNeely and Mrs. Clark, we have approximately 18 participants on now. Everybody that was in the waiting room has been admitted into the meeting. And so whenever you all are ready, I'll continue to admit people in as they come.
Kim, before
Yes, ma'am.
the superintendent gets started, can you take down for a moment the screen sharing so I can see everyone?
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
To do that.
Yes, ma'am. There you go.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November 19th District Advisory Council meeting. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our new board chairperson, Dr. Leonetta McNeely. She will be chairing the meeting in her new role. I guess this is her first District Advisory Council meeting of this term as chair. So Dr. McNeely.
Thank you, Superintendent Clark. Hello, everyone. And we will start with the approval of the minutes from October 1st. May I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. It's been properly moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. I see different hands and I heard a couple of ayes. So we're going to say the minutes are approved. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of welcoming John Gilsworth, who's been with us before from DRMP, and he's going to be sharing a review of our options for rezoning. Mr. Gilsworth.
Thank you. Congratulations, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much.
I'd also like to welcome Ms. Diana Johnson, our new school board attorney, who is here with us. So welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and need to be made presenter. I don't know if I am already, Dr. McNeely.
You are.
Okay,
yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, so thank you all for being here. It's been about a month or two since we've talked last. We're going to go through today the review of the planning considerations. We're going to talk about the zoning effort overall. We're going to review the options, and we're going to have an open discussion to hear your thoughts. But we're going to take you through sort of what we've completed already, and give you a review of the options. And we have about 50 slides to go through. And so I want to make sure we get through these in time for everybody to have questions and talk. So with that, I'm going to get started. I've kind of already covered this initial agenda. I'm not going to do anybody on the admitting. You'll see that on my screen, but I'm not going to handle any of the admitting into the waiting room right now. So again, we'll cover the planning considerations, which we covered in a previous presentation to you. We're going to give you an overview of the effort, what we've done up until we talked to you, since we talked to you, as well as a review of the zoning options, and most importantly, have our open discussion. So jumping into the planning considerations, this is going to be a familiar slide for a lot of you. You know, when we look at the board policy, number one, we are addressing capacity for elementary I and the surrounding schools. In previous presentations, we've talked about the capacity of the schools. We're considering infrastructure, future land use, and future development in these areas as well. We're thinking about diversity in programming, and this is not just diversity of race. We're thinking about the programming as well, and we're thinking about ESE, ELL, all the programs that go into making up a school. We also have to be cognizant of the timeline it's going to take, because I is under construction, will be opening in the fall. So there are decisions that are going to have to be made on the programmatic side of things for the school that we need to have ready. And we'll talk about those timelines in this presentation. We want the student bodies to be reflective of the district's racial composition. And we also need to consider the sales tax and the current construction projects going on right now and the ones that are planned. So obviously elementary I is well underway to construction. Idlewild is rounding the corner on design into construction. Metcalf had a wall raised the other day, not a portable, a wall raised the other day. Bishop Middle School is also under construction. So there's 4 concurrent construction projects going on right now. Our facility staff is doing an amazing job. The goal of these projects are to increase capacity and remove portables. And we have renovation and construction at every school planned. We want to avoid as much as we can to make any of the neighboring or the contiguous schools less representative. When we think about Idlewild is one of the major planning considerations. We have significant capacity issues at Idlewild. This is why it was one of the first schools in the facilities initiative. And our goal is to open Idlewild next fall with no portables. I don't have to tell any of you about the transportation concerns. We've heard a lot of input on transportation through the input sessions that we've given, and these are along the major roads going west to east in the morning, east to west in the afternoon. And we have our other major planning consideration, which is Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook is significantly over capacity as well. There is a large zone at Meadowbrook. We've incorporated more information than the last time this was done to avoid Meadowbrook opening at full capacity and then having portables 2 years down the road. So to date, we have built upon a half-decade of planning data. So that's student address locations, development review, capacity, facility projects. There's been a wealth of information that's gone into the work that we're presenting to you today. The elementary I site was selected through the School Planning Advisory Committee, made of appointed members and members of the public, 2017-2018. The facilities initiative was approved by voters, and the schedule was approved by the board in 2019. And we've had an initial board review, and we have essentially completed the input from the schools and the public through the fall of 2020 for the first set of input sessions. So we held these virtual school meetings for the any of the schools that could potentially be affected between October and November 2020. We also had a dedicated website on the district's overall website created. We had an email address for comment, as well as a Google input form for people to add input. I believe that has been shared with the DAC. We have had 2 open house meetings. One was virtual, the other one was held at in the boardroom. And we've also completed a interactive map we put out for people to review the zones down to their parcel. So you can see the changes that will affect you and your neighbors, as well as everywhere else in the district. Today, we're also going to show you option F. Option F is a new option we've created based on the community input we have received from the public. So we'll show you that at the end. And it is an option that has been refined based on the comments we've gotten. What's upcoming? Why are we doing this right now? Because we have I being open in the fall, but what do we have to do in between now and then? We have to start readying the address ranges for the new zones that are approved by the board in early February. So we're working on that through January and March. Oh, that's a typo in there. I'm sorry, I should say exceptions. Updates for zoning exceptions and school choice, March 2021. Sometimes spell check isn't a good thing. We want to update the transportation software for routing based on any zoning exceptions, based on the address ranges, based on the decision by the board in early February. We've extended the magnet application deadline into mid-February for any impacted students in these schools. But we also have the school assignments in the kindergarten roundup occurring through May, June 2021. So there are some things we have to do to open every school, not just I, over the course of the late winter and spring. Looking at the current zones, again, this information has been out in presentations on the website. You can also go to the interactive map to view these zones. So we have an overall map for you of the current zones, but we'll jump right into option A. And this is one that you've seen before. Option A is, for lack of better term, called a cookie cutter, where we're coming in and dropping an area right around I and only affecting the contiguous zones. Now, there's been a lot of comment from the public on please have the least level of impact possible. And we hear that. And we have taken that into consideration with every option we've drawn. But anytime we're going to come in and draw any zone around I, we're going to affect at least 4 to 5 zones that are contiguous to I. So the map you're seeing now is the I zone with the current school zones drawn underneath to show you the amount of impact for each of those zones. In a nutshell, option A addresses some of the development occurring along Archer Road and the development occurring in the town of Tioga area. Option A takes in Brookside Apartments just east of 143rd on Newberry Road. They're currently being bused out to Newberry, and they would go about 5 miles closer to Elementary I. Option A removes 98 from Meadowbrook. We're looking to try to get to about 150 students out of Meadowbrook, so that doesn't quite meet the goal, but it does remove some of the significant overcrowding at Wiles as well. What option A does not affect is Idlewild. Option A also isn't the most diverse, right? When we're looking for that board goal, this is an option that's about 60% white, and that is not at the goal of the equity plan. So we started looking at option A in a little bit more depth, and you can see the breakdowns from the zoning and option A. Now I included Idlewild in there so you could see it. Idlewild is not affected by option A. In the past, we did these in pie charts, and the comments I was getting back was, let's just do this in tables. It's a little bit easier to compare across the board. So this is option A, and what you're looking at are the different breakdowns of demographics for the potentially zoned students. We're also showing you the total of the current zone students and the potentially zoned students, because one of the things I've told you is we're trying to address capacity. So the schools that are at 120, 118, 130% capacity, we're trying to reduce the number of students zoned to those schools and directly address the capacity there. So you can see these breakdowns in option A. Option B extends a little bit further east along Archer Road. It takes in a significant area of apartment complexes around Celebration Point. So that is Oak Park, the reserve at Kanapaha. Also on the south side of Archer, there's the Palms. So this removes over 426 students from Wiles. It also removes 216 from Idlewild. So that meets the goal in that area. This is a lot more diverse population for the school, but it also is at 845 total students. So we're nearing that total design for I of 900 student stations. So that's not ideal either. But really between option A and option B to consider is you have two areas of development we're trying to address, which is Town of Tioga, 143rd Street, that area on Newberry Road. We know the golf course is for sale, West End Golf Course. We know that there's a lot of development and permits in that area because we track development. But we also have Idlewild. And so there is a push and pull of development on either side of I, Southwest Gainesville and up on Newberry Road that we are having to consider when we're populating I. Looking at option B, you can see that there are more schools that are not affected by option B. There's a better breakdown in I. You have reduction of students across the board. But again, we're looking at 845 students. It doesn't really remove as many students as we want for Meadowbrook. Option C expands on option A and option B. Option C's two big highlights are elementary I extends east over to the swag area, Southwest 20th Ave, and also cuts Meadowbrook at 39th Avenue. And we had a lot of comments on these areas from the public. Something to note on option C, in 2019, we had about 800 students, and in 2020, there were 863. So you can see the development pouring in this area. And you can go to the county's growth management site and look at how they track development and see the maps that they have, and they are centered in a lot of these areas that we're talking about. Option C removes over 300 from Idlewild and 350 from Meadowbrook. So this is an option that takes significant amounts of students in, but had spawned a lot of public comment because of the expansion of Terwilliger North and cutting off Meadowbrook, as well as the expansion of the I zone over to the swag area. So here's the breakdown for option C. You can see elementary I is at 37% white, 39% black, 10% Hispanic, 7% multi-race, 6% Asian. So this is an improvement for that goal of equity. We got a lot of comments on C about transportation, particularly for the Terwilliger zone, as well as students having to travel west to Parker Road. So I won't spend a lot of time on each of these close-ups. Again, this has been available for about the past month and a half. We've had the website up so you can really zoom in to look at these areas as you want down to the parcel level. But I'll quickly go through them. Archer on this one stays about the same with their overall population. Chiles expands east to Wiles to Tower Road, and that's not ideal. That's not a line that is one of my favorites. I'll just put it like that. But this was a balance for that neighborhood. That is a potential area to look at some more if option C is something that the board does decide to go forward on, or the DAC wants to recommend. You can see the Hidden Oak zone here. In the Idlewild zone. Now, to note on Idlewild, we talked a lot about Idlewild. Idlewild, we take over 300 students out of Idlewild. We're removing students from the Celebration Point area, from the Finley Woods development that's coming online south of Archer Road. And we also take some of the students in the northeastern portion of Idlewild and rezone them up to Metcalf in this option, or at least out of Idlewild. And so that is something else to consider. You have the southwestern area out of Archer Road that's been removed from Idlewild, as well as this area, Main Street down to 16th. You can see the reduction of the Meadowbrook zone. It also extends further west to 143rd in this option. You can see the dramatic reduction at Meadowbrook down to 596 proposed zone. But the diversity of Meadowbrook was affected dramatically by this zone. So while it takes into account all the development, making room for that development, also giving Meadowbrook back their field and removing the portables, this is sort of the push and pull of a neighborhood school versus a diverse school. In some of these areas, you really have to go out far with the zones to try to meet every part of the board policy and equity plan. Looking at Newberry, we're able to bring down the population of Newberry in this option. A portion of Newberry is zoned into Meadowbrook as well as Archer. We had a lot of comments north of Newberry Road during the Newberry meeting on that portion of the option. This is the other big expansion in C, where Terwilliger moves north along the I-75 line. And so we got a lot of comments north of 39th. We got comments from the Shenandoah area. And this was a very, this sparked a lot of discussion, I'll put it that way. Terwilliger is taking in students who are currently attending Meadowbrook, while the Terwilliger potentially zoned amount of students goes down. The overall diversity of the student body goes up, but there are transportation concerns that were posed to us by the parents. What I will note is this area north of 39th, as well as this area by Butler Plaza, both of those areas are outside of that 2-mile zone that, you know, the district is then required to provide transport for students. So those are about the only 2 areas within the city of Gainesville's limits that are outside of those zones. There's a lot of coverage within those 2-mile zones in the city of Gainesville. And as you move west of I-75, you don't have that same overlapping of 2-mile areas. With the exception of north of 39th and Butler Plaza, those areas are completely eligible for transport. Wiles comes down but takes in a lot of the Idlewild zone in this. It has a pretty diverse student body as a result of this rezoning, potential rezoning option. Option D doesn't change much. Option D only extends Meadowbrook, a portion of Meadowbrook east of I-75. So we'll look briefly at how the Meadowbrook numbers drop down from above 60% white to about 54% by making this change. This was still heavily commented on primarily by the Meadowbrook parents, as you can see in a lot of the input forms. This is the change overall for Meadowbrook. You can see the student body goes up to, potentially zoned student body goes up to about 750 versus the 550 or so that we were looking at in option C. And you can see option D with Terwilliger having a portion of the zone east of I-75 carved back out and put in Meadowbrook for this option. This decreases the overall diversity of Terwilliger as well as decreases the student population down to 423 in Terwilliger. Potentially zoned students, I should say. So we came upon option E and we started looking at option E. This removes over 300 from Idlewild, removes less than 100 from Meadowbrook, because we've attempted to try to address the development in Meadowbrook in the town of Tioga area while leaving the area east of 39th for the most part untouched, with a smaller extension of Terwilliger pushing up. So you can see I still extends east into the swag area on this and has a student population of 47% white, 33% black, 7% Hispanic, 6% multi-race, and 6% Asian. Also note that in this option, I has 863 students as well. Terwilliger, you can see, and Meadowbrook, and option E, you can see where their diversity is compared to the previous options. But let's look at each zone. In option E, Archer is still fairly static. We're not moving a lot of children out of Archer in this option. Chiles had some students taken out. The Chiles boundary reverts back to sort of where it is with Wiles right now. It goes down and takes in the Longleaf Longleaf and Mentone subdivisions, which is about 300 to 400 students in that area. Another thing to note on option E, we extend Chiles east all the way to 75 and do away with the current enclave that's there. Chiles is actually 2 zones, and so is Hidden Oak. And portions of the swag area are separated out and sent to Chiles as a non-contiguous zone. And through this option, we attempted to remove those enclaves. And so that's why you see it extending all the way east there, as well as down to Longleaf and Mentone across Archer Road. So what this does for Chiles is it bumps their population up, and that is not ideal for them. But I think that there is a medium there, possibly between the border with Chiles and Wiles, to address that. But that is something to note in this option. Each one of these options has something that isn't perfect for somebody, and we're all going to have to really be cognizant of that as we go through the discussions and the ultimate recommendations to the board. Option E in elementary I takes in the town of Tioga, goes up into the West End Golf Course, still extends east to the swag area, and does not go down and take in Logano, Longleaf, Mentone. So it stops at Archer Road and deals with the development in Meadowbrook, as well as some of the development coming down Parker Road. This proposed zone will give elementary I 841 students, still with a balance that's almost right in within the district's ideal equity goal. Hidden Oak, a portion of Hidden Oak on the west goes to Meadowbrook, and the Hidden Oak also extends down to take in a portion of the of its previous enclave into the swag area. And so that's something that we want you to know about Hidden Oak. We want to do away with the enclaves in swag too. And so you can see the current zone and the proposed zone, 773, 765 for Hidden Oak, with a fairly diverse student body, with the changes on the west and the southeast side. Idlewild zone really doesn't have a lot of changes in E compared to the previous ones. We feel good about the level of development that we're able to remove out of Idlewild to make sure that it's not going to go astronomic into 1,200 zone students, or as these developments come online at Finley Woods, we're not going to see a dramatic increase in capacity at Idlewild with the construction being completed next fall. So option E isn't really that different for Idlewild, but it is important to note that it does address the development in that area. Option E is different than the other options because it does introduce Littlewood. And this was based on input from our first presentation to the board to look east. And so we did look east for Littlewood, Terwilliger. So a portion of the Littlewood student body in this option south of 20th Avenue goes up 62nd, 20th to 62nd to Terwilliger rather than up 34th to Littlewood. This brings Littlewood population down in anticipation of the construction occurring there, where they're going to have to go across the street to stay in the transition school after the Westwood students are done, after the Bishop students move back when Bishop is done. And so we're trying to get ahead of the construction there with the swing school right across the street. This is an option that was introduced in option E based on input. Meadowbrook is touched by the removing a portion of the Meadowbrook area down by Town of Tioga and Newberry Road, as well as a portion north of Northwest 23rd within the city of Gainesville. And you can see that on this map. The proposed zone for Meadowbrook is not ideal, but it does remove a little under 100 students, and we're thinking that may get them to the goal. I said 150 is the ultimate goal, but like I said, this isn't ideal. Every option has something that isn't ideal for everybody, and this was sort of the compromise we made at Meadowbrook to, okay, well, we can get the development out of Meadowbrook, we can address the input that we've gotten from the community with this option. And looking at Newberry, Newberry's zone now extends back east versus C and D. Newberry's zone extends back east to 143rd. We had some comments in the Newberry meeting from parents in that area. And so we've extended that zone back east in option E. It's still cutting down on the number of students that are attending Newberry. So it's helping them on their capacity issues, but it doesn't help on diversity. We're actually going to take the Brookside apartment in this option, and they go to, I believe, the new school. I have to go back and check on that. Options can sometimes run in my head, but Newberry in this option still, has a diversity, doesn't meet the overall equity goal of the board. But then again, this is where we're running into a neighborhood school versus a diverse school. And in some cases in this county, it is hard to meet both of those goals. Terwilliger, you can see, extends north of 23rd and has the extension down south to Archer Road, and taking in a portion of that Littlewood zone. So you can see, even with that expansion, the Terwilliger population continues to drop in option E down to 370, and that's not ideal for them. That is a diverse student body for Terwilliger, but looking at that area, that student population, that is something to point out in this option. And Wiles, the zone expands south of Archer Road, takes in the development along Finley Woods, takes in a portion of the development that's coming in on Archer. It drops the potentially zoned students by about 100, but it removes a lot of the students from Idlewild to alleviate their significant overcrowding. So it's not as dramatic for Wiles as some of the other options, but you're still seeing a reduction in the potentially zoned students while addressing the capacity at Idlewild. And so now I want to go to option F. Option F has been drawn based on the input received from the very first board presentation, from our very first DAC presentation, and from all the public input that we've gotten. Ms. Neal, Mr. Charbonnet have done a great job with curating all of that information and getting it out to you. I'm not going to read the hundreds of comments. That is for everybody to do on their own leisure time. I've done it, but we have tried to make a option now that addresses what we heard from people. Okay, and so in option F, the highlights are 750 total students in I. This removes 220 from Idlewild and removes almost 200 from Meadowbrook. So we've checked off some of those goals. Let's go through and look at the breakdown. Here's the problem with F. If we're going to draw zones contiguous around I and not extend into Swag or extend up Archer Road into the Celebration Point or the Idlewild zone, it is going to be hard to meet the overall board's stated goal for equity. You can look here with option I, that's 59% white, 13% black.
Mr. Gilray, excuse me. Can you state what is the board's stated goal for equity that you keep mentioning? What is the actual percentage?
I've mentioned it in numerous meetings. I'll do it again. It's
Yes,
42%
please, because
white.
I just don't remember it exactly.
Yes, ma'am. It's 42% white, 34% African American, 11% Hispanic, 7% multi-race, 5% Asian. Now, that's not the goal. That is the student body as a whole. And the goal states, and you can go read the policy, but it's something along the lines of, we will try to meet and be representative of the overall student body.
Thank you.
So going through I, that has been the challenge with I, is if it's going to be a school, we're just going to draw around I. We're not going to extend out into some of these areas. It's going to be hard to meet the overall representative student body for I. What F is one of the options that really tries to minimize the impact. And so you can see who's not affected. Hidden Oak, Terwilliger, Littlewood. The effects in Newberry, the effects in Meadowbrook are in these areas that we're talking about. Brookside Apartments for Newberry. So it's a small portion of the Newberry zone. The Meadowbrook is the area around Tioga. So let's just go look at the zones instead of me talking to a graph. You can see I on this. I extends and takes in town of Tioga, takes in Brookside, who's being bussed out west of Newberry right now, takes in West End Golf Course that's for sale, takes in a lot of the developments in that area. You have the option of going even further north and taking in more developments, if that's a direction that people want to go in. It extends down Parker Road. There's a number of developments on Parker Road that it takes in. And then it runs down to Archer and takes in Logano. And if anybody's driven by Logano, that site is completely cleared and leveled. They are ready to build homes. Everything's been approved there for a while. It's just taken some time. They have phase 1 in, I believe, and more is coming. You can see Longleaf and Mentone in this, and those are taken in areas of 300 students. And so this is addressing the development that's occurred on Archer that is essentially capped now by the urban cluster south of Logano. This takes in Meadows on the Prairie. Meadows on the Prairie currently travels to Archer, and what we heard from them, from parents there, was everybody works in Gainesville and we're having to drop our kids off in Archer and come back in. So we're looking at the development that's occurred on Archer because it's capped southwest of Logano by the urban cluster. It's going to take an amendment to the comprehensive plan to change that. But it extends up and takes in a lot of the development coming that we know is coming for Tioga in those areas. It also is addressing the comments we heard from the Childs parents, the Meadowbrook parents, the Wiles parents of, we don't want to travel west to go to school. We work east. And so we heard that a lot. And you can go through your input sessions and or the input and read all the messages that came in. But when we drew this, we're looking at the parents who are on Newberry, who are on Archer, who could get to Parker Road, drop their children off, and get back in. There's multiple options to get back east that way. But that was something that we heard again and again and again. And this is why I looks the way it does for option F. Archer reflects the changes from I taking out Meadows on the Prairie. It really doesn't affect Newberry. It really is just this area, Logano, Meadow on the Prairie, And so this drops Archer. If we take Meadows on the Prairie, if we take those homes in that area out of Archer and put them in the new school, we drop Archer to 363 potentially zoned students. So that's not ideal either. There is something to pick apart in each one of these options. You can see the Childs. We don't touch the Enclave and Childs in this. We had some comments on this area, and so Childs is an area for this one that really is carved out by eye. You can see the Cobblefield neighborhood stays in Childs. The neighborhoods north of Childs stay in the Childs zone. It's really the areas west that come out into eye in this option. The Enclave and the Swag area stays. That's a current zone, and that's kept in this option. Idlewild, this area does not, on this northeast corner, doesn't come down along Main and 16th. It stays there. Idlewild takes in some additional areas along Williston Road in this option. Now, Idlewild in this option is at a potentially zone about 785 students. We know the students that we're taking out of Idlewild, and we know they are by far and large attending Idlewild. And so while that number looks a little bit higher than the other options in Idlewild, we know who is going to be who is attending those schools currently in the areas that we're moving or proposing to move the zones in. Meadowbrook is essentially untouched. We heard a lot from Meadowbrook parents, and where we do carve out is the areas of development in that southwest corner. And so that drops their population down. It does not change the diversity in Meadowbrook significantly. And, you know, when we heard the least amount of impact, this was one way to have the least amount of impact on students overall. Newberry is really affected only by the Brookside. It's hard to see in this one, but it's a little small corner on 143rd and Newberry that will be going to I. The rest of Newberry is essentially untouched. You can see that makes the diversity trend higher towards white students. But that is just the fact of if you're going to move the Brookside apartments to I, where they're closer, then you're going to have a decrease in overall diversity at Newberry. You can see the Wild Zone extend down, taking a lot of that development and planned development that's coming. It drops the, almost 200, over 200 out of the potential zone. And it makes for one of the most diverse schools in the district in terms of almost, almost exceeding the goal really of the equity plan, as well as the other races. And so Wiles in this option is a larger zone with less students. Our next steps. We are going to send a survey link out to each of you on the DAC. What we're hoping we get back are the options that you recommend to the rezoning committee to review before we bring the preferred recommendations to the board. We do that in December 1st. We have a rule development workshop with the board. December 15th is the first reading of policy at a board meeting. January 13th, we have a public hearing, and February 2nd, we have a final reading and board vote. This is the end of my presentation. I'm going to open it back up for discussion, but I do want to tell you that it's been an amazing process. We've had, I believe, 9 night meetings where we have gotten fantastic input. We have gotten new things to consider. We have gotten tremendous participation across the Google input form, as well as emails to the email that we set up. And I truly feel like we've taken what we've heard from the community back in option F to present to you at the DAC, as well as all the other options. They are different. Each of the options has their own flavor. And I can tell you that it's not an easy decision. It's not easy to draw these lines. And when you draw a line in one area, you're going to be affecting something in another area. And so we have to be cognizant of that. We had a lot of comments about, singular issues in one area that if you did make that change, it dramatically changes something else somewhere else. And I won't calling out in specifics, but because we have a lot of them, but that is something to consider when we look at, well, why isn't this neighborhood in, or why isn't this house in? We tried to not break up neighborhoods. We tried as much as we could to draw these along subdivision and road right-of-ways, division lines and road right-of-ways. We tried to consider all portions of the board policy, with the number one being capacity. And so what we have will never be completely 100% perfect. But I feel that it is a great step forward to bring to you all for review, for ultimately recommendation to the board. With that, I'm going to stop and pass it back to Ms. Neal. I probably talked a lot longer than I should have, but I thought it was important to cover all of this. Thank you.
Dr. McNeely, could I, if it's appropriate, if it's not appropriate, tell me. This is Dr. Paulson. I have one simple question. Is that okay?
All right, Dr. Paulson, Mr. Gilworth, are you going to accept questions at this point before we go to the next item? Dr. Paulson has a question.
I am here to do whatever you all would like me to do. I will defer to Ms. Neal, who I'm reporting to, or Superintendent Clark on that, however you want to handle it. I'm here for the remainder of the meeting.
Dr. Paulson.
Is that all right,
Ms. Neal, it's fine, right? Dr. Paulson, please go ahead with your question.
Well, thank you. The schools for F that you went through just now was Archer, Childs, Idlewild, Meadowbrook, Newberry, and Wiles. Is that correct?
Let me go back and confirm for you. I'll read them to you. Archer, Childs, Idlewild, I obviously, Meadowbrook, small portion of Newberry, and Wiles for F.
Okay, well then I'll wait till later if it might not be appropriate right now, but I just wanted that. That's what I heard. That's what I wrote down.
And that's, that's why I made the comment early on. This is for the benefit of everybody. Wherever we draw the zone, we're going to be touching at least 4 other schools. So there's no option that's just like 1 or 2 zones that are touched. Wherever we draw that zone, we're going to have 4 or 5 schools touched. So when we talk about minimal impact, it may, we may say, hey, you're touching 5 schools. That's not minimal. But some of those portions are very small of those zones. I just want to clarify that if I didn't make that clear enough.
Terwilliger was not in there.
No, sir, not on that option. Nor was Hidden Oak.
Right, not impacted by F.
Not impacted. Well, you know what? I'm going to come. I have another question I'll bring later about Terwilliger.
Okay.
You know where that is.
Thank you. Madam Chair, are you okay for us to move right on into the review of citizen input?
Please.
Okay, thank you so much. So you should have all received a 1-page summary of citizen input that gave you the number of responses. 418 respond to the citizen input form, that Google form. We had, in addition to that, 150 plus emails. A lot of the emails were some input that was duplicated on the form. Some were just questions. In that, we gave you the breakdown. Some families may have fit more than one of the options of, were they a parent of students in our schools? Were they an employee? Were they an Alachua County resident, or other examples? So you have that breakdown as well. And then we asked for all of the people who filled out that citizen input form to rank the options. And at that time, keep in mind, please, that option F is a very new option based on all of this input. So F was not included in this form because it came from all of the input from the form. So it was not included for that feedback. So I just want to make that clear as we go through this as well. It was a result of all the feedback, so it wasn't included. So we asked for anyone who filled out that citizen input form. And again, it was for community members, current parents, employees, anybody who filled that out, to rank those options from strongly opposed to strongly support, 1 to 5. And you have those percentage results in what was sent to you. What I do want to call attention to as we talk about that, and Mr. Charbonnet, as our co-chair for this group, please feel free to jump in at any point on this as well, is one of the questions did ask, in what elementary school zone, current zone, do you reside? And if you look at that breakdown, what you will see is 50%, a little over 50% of the responses to this input form came from the current Meadowbrook zone. So the results, and I don't want to say they're skewed, but you have to keep in mind 50% of the results came from that one current school zone. The next closest to that was also the one that we heard the second most emails about as well, was the Childs Elementary School current zone, with almost 19% of the responses. And much of that was in that Cobblefield, Avalon area, just north of Childs Elementary. So as you look at the breakdowns in those percentages, I think it is important to also keep in mind where the population of the answers were coming from as well, because it definitely does lend some perspective as you review those. Mr. Charbonnet, do you want to add to that, please?
Just to add on to that, Ms. Neal, I would reinforce that those neighborhoods that are heavily represented in terms of their response on the input forms, also at all of the citizen input and parent input meetings, talked about how they had organized as a community to give that input. So they had traveled through the neighborhood, passed out flyers on people's doors, gave talking points to the community and so forth. And it was very effective because they did essentially flood us with lots of input from those particular neighborhoods, giving their perspective on how this would inconvenience they and their family or affect them and their child. And I think that's important to keep in mind, who are the constituents and parents that we have not heard from as much, those that perhaps haven't been as well organized, those that perhaps don't have active groups speaking for them, but are still representing very, very important populations within our school district. So I think that, I wouldn't presume to tell anyone their job, but I think all of us on the DAC and the school board know that we're looking at this from the perspective of what's best for the entire county, and trying to balance that with individual impacts on certain people, families, and their preferences as well. So some folks in the county haven't spoken up and haven't been as well represented, but they are also going to be very much impacted by this.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for adding that. That is a key piece. The other thing that I just want to add as well is, and I mentioned the emails to the rezoning email account. As we were answering those, we were also referring those people to answer the citizen input form. Most of those, I would say the majority of those did then go in and answer that citizen input form as well. So some of the, what you have is just the citizen input form documentation summary. The emails really do align very well with that, with what that looks like on your summary sheet also. So with that, Madam Chair, that's the review of the citizen input received thus far.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Neal. For the citizens now, I don't know if we have the capability other than the DAC folk. Mrs. Superintendent, can you tell me that? You're muted.
There, sorry about that. I would have to look, and I don't have control of the Zoom meeting right now. I do not believe that we do not have that call-in capability right now.
Okay. All right,
on
thank
this
you.
meeting.
Well,
So,
if we don't have that capability, let's go with our DAC
yes, ma'am.
members to see if you should have questions or additional comments. We'll certainly take them at this time.
This is Sue Legg, and I have a question, and that is, we had talked in previous DAC meeting about projected school achievement in terms of school grades and the impact of different zoning options. Racial equity is correlated with that to an extent, but I don't know what the impact of option F is on projected school grades in Terwilliger and Idlewild, for example. Can you give us a quick
I can
summary
answer,
of that? Because I've been
answer.
hearing a lot about that from people asking me about Terwilliger is a D school, or, and it wouldn't be depending on how it's zoned or if we close it or whatever we're going to do.
I'm going to answer briefly on option F. Doesn't involve Terwilliger, so if the school's not involved, there's no projected achievement change for that option. Option F is so new. I mean, we gave Littlewood on Monday. Option F is so new. We're running through those now, but we have done that for the other schools. But there is a caveat, and I think that Mr. Charbonnet, I hate to put him on the spot because I've heard I could probably do it for him, but I think he's the best one to do it. If he could talk about the achievement metric.
Certainly. And Sue, the question about option F, I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now because today was the first unveiling publicly of option F. We haven't seen this option until now because it's based on the input that was collected from folks reviewing options A through E. So I haven't had a chance to run any kind of simulated grades on option F. But for options A through E, simulated grades have been calculated. And in each case, for every option, they did not result in any school grades for the affected schools going down a letter grade. And in some cases, school grades would go up under these simulations. But again, these are not predicted grades. They're simulated grades with the most recent test scores that we have. There was no standardized testing last year. So we're going back to the 2018-19 school grade and looking at the students that would have lived in these zones had these been the attendance zones, not necessarily the students who actually attended these schools. So some students will live in a school zone, but go to a different school, either for attending a magnet or going to a charter school or through a zoning exemption or school choice. But this is just looking at the students that would have been zoned, but again, using 2-year-old data. So I would not put a great deal of faith in these simulations as predictions, but I think that they will show you that if the students in the zone do attend the school to which they are zoned, that under using 2-year-old data, that would not have negatively affected any of the school grades.
Thinking about that, can you say no school will be expected to have a D or an F school grade?
I can say that our simulations did not generate any schools with Ds or Fs in options A through E. Have not run the simulation yet for option F. Looking at the schools that are impacted and the number of students, I don't anticipate that there would be significant swings in that data. However, I wouldn't want to bet the farm on that until I've actually seen the populations of the zones.
I would agree with that, Jeff. I'll bet your farm, not my farm right now, but I would agree with that we wouldn't see major change. I don't anticipate any decrease for sure.
If I may, my name is Heather Sterncy. I'm concerned with, oh, I'm sorry, Dr. McNeely. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, go right ahead.
I was concerned with on the F plan for Archer, because with, of course, smaller enrollment, it leads to less funding per child. So I'm concerned with our rural school of Archer, where they just get pushed by the wayside because we're taking a substantial amount of students away. I don't know their capacity, if that's going to help them, but I am concerned what kind of position is this going to put them into funding with this F plan.
I think one of the things with Archer that we also keep in mind is this is looking at schools within the actual zone. Archer having that magnet, their population may be increased over that zoned amount because they have students who come in from out of zone as well. Absolutely hearing that decrease in numbers, again, thinking that is zoned only students. So their magnet population would increase the potential actual attendance, but it would still potentially cause a decrease in overall enrollment.
And that's an excellent comment. Thank you for that. And it's, I think Archer is definitively a hard one because of, a large portion of their population is right there at, Meadows on the Prairie, Hammock Ridge. There's some rural lot subdivisions right there north of Archer Road, west of Parker. And if you're looking at where to put or where to draw a line, and you don't want to take out a neighborhood, the minute you draw a line around Meadows on the Prairie, there's 100 kids in there and they're out. And so we don't want to split Meadows on the Prairie. We don't want to have neighbors on either side go to a different school. So that's been a big challenge, just like a Longleaf with 300 children in it. That's a big chunk to say we're not going to cut the subdivision and move neighbors with neighbors, which I think is a good goal. That's what we want to do. We don't want to split neighbors. But the comments we received from Archer, while we didn't receive as many as some of the other schools, were predominantly, it's easier for me to go up Parker. Really, they wanted to go to Wiles is where they wanted to go on their way into town. But that is a consideration we're having to think about. And it's a challenge at that, what we call the urban cluster governed by the comprehensive plan, of these areas along on the outer skirts of the perimeter of the urban area. Some of them are zoned to rural schools, and it's a 5, 6, 7 mile drive out, then to come back in. And so to take out one of those populations, it does do something like that. But as Ms. Neal mentioned, there is the magnet program there, and as I mentioned before, there are things with each option that are not ideal for a specific subset of the population.
Mrs. Sorensen, was that question answer enough for you?
Yes, ma'am. I said my main concern is I don't want us going closing schools down. That's my biggest thing. And I know there's been comments in the past, and I am very passionate about my rural schools, and I appreciate and love seeing the magnet within Archer. And we just want to make sure those kids are going to be serviced. And again, the funding is going to be there to provide them with all their needs instead of, hey, let's just give them what we, So yes, thank you very much for answering.
No, thank you. That's a great comment.
Other questions?
Yes, I have some questions.
Yeah.
All right, Ms. Crosby.
So first, I was wondering how many meetings were held?
How many school meetings? Was that the question?
Yes, in person.
Yeah, they were done via Zoom. We did one per potentially impacted school. So each school had their own evening. We also had a district-wide Zoom meeting, and we had an in-person evening. It was from 4 to 8 one evening for people to be able to come in and speak with staff and Mr. Gilreath about all of the options. We had larger poster size maps for people to look at that
Great.
in-person event. So we did
Great.
one in-person event from 4 to 8 o'clock one evening.
Okay, thank you. And were the e-school, I saw where I watched 2 of the virtual meetings, and then I've read a lot of comments, and I think I read this, I can't remember where I read it, but an e-school parent missed an announcement, and I thought I should ask, were e-school parents informed through e-school?
I'm not sure that I have a direct answer to that question. Mrs. Clark, I don't know if you do. I know there were like district announcements that went out.
Right. So we advertised all the meetings district-wide. The one thing when students enroll in eSchool, that becomes their school of record because it is a separate school. Now, the Digital Academy kids, which I think we're all probably familiar with the Digital Academy because you guys have been so plugged in, those students are still assigned to their home zone school, but they were advertised district-wide. So, I mean, anybody could have come and participated, but they were not submitted to eSchool directly.
Okay. I would just suggest, for future initiatives, maybe because we do have so many students in eSchool now with the COVID situation. There may be other things that come up that I would suggest to the chair that we want to keep them in mind because of the unique times that we're in.
Certainly.
Yeah, we may want to include them in certain announcements. So I want to ask about E, Mr. Gilreath, option E. Could we look at the map?
Sure, what I'll do is pull up the interactive map, which is probably the best way to do it because these static ones don't work very well. You can do the same thing. I'll give you the chat so you can pull it up. That's the best way to look at this data.
I'll post that for you, Mr. Gilreath, in the chat if you just want to work on getting yours pulled up. That's fine.
I know that you probably see these in your sleep. I hope you don't, but
I do.
So option E, and I read the 36 pages of comments. I'm just wondering, maybe you're going to tell me, well, this is actually what option F is, what I'm about to ask you, but I don't think so.
Is there an area that you want me to center in on?
I'm wondering if option E, if you took out the Robbins Lane families from option E and the Cobblefield.
Let me then.
Or is Cobblefield included? The situation.
Let me show you option. You want option E?
Right.
Option E includes Cobblefield. Option F removes that area there.
So if E,
I'll go back to E.
I personally like E, but I also personally
Here's
particularly understand the Robbins Lane family. I watched the Meadowbrook presentation, and I will shout out, I don't know anyone that lives in Robbins Lane personally, but Ms. Wernicke, I don't know Ms. Wernicke, but I understand that the situation there, and option E impacts those families north of 39th, right?
Yes, so here's option E, and here, in option E, they're back in Meadowbrook.
They're back in Meadowbrook, option E.
Robbins Lane is back in Meadowbrook in option E.
Okay, what about Cobblefield?
Cobblefield is in I in option E.
And so how many families, how badly would it impact? What problem would it be if they could remain in Childs? How badly does that impact the equity goal if Cobblefield stayed in Childs?
Off the top of my head, I can't give you an exact number.
Yeah, I understand.
I can tell you that Robin Lane over to 43rd Street, I mean, all of those, that's about 100 and almost 200 children there. So it's a big chunk.
Well, I mean, if you stayed with E, but just the Cobblefield, if you took them out of the E.
I haven't done a complete analysis just on that neighborhood.
Because environmentally, traffic-wise, family-wise, to have people who are walking, you know, basically next door to their school and to disrupt that way when we're looking at another rezoning coming right up, that one particularly, I kind of agreed with them, and then the Robbins Lane. But you say Robbins Lane is not impacted by E?
Not in E, and in F, both of them stay in their schools because of the input that we received.
Yeah, F doesn't particularly appeal to me for other reasons, but
Everybody
E,
has their preferences, right? I mean, there's not something perfect for everybody in each of these options.
Right. F, I don't see a lot personally of value. But I came to the meeting with the idea of what if E, and I would like to just make a pitch, and Madam Chair, just on principle, those Robbins Lane families, using them as an example of becoming a more family-friendly district.
Yes.
Overall, anything we can do to become a more family-friendly. I would love us to be the model family-friendly district of Florida. And this is a great example. Moving children 3 times in 9 years, potentially, that's, you know, even without COVID, that's a really not great. None of us here would want that for any relative of ours. It's very unsettling. And Miss Wernicke, I really could feel for her and her family, even if it's different children in the same family. You know, as an educator myself, we know that's not best practices. And I think that would set a great tone to maybe establish some point in the future as one of the, might be personally, as another one of the principles of, you know, setting a limit on how many times we move a subdivision, rezone a subdivision in a number of years. As she said, you know, we and you mentioned, Mr. Gelreich, to her, you know, the area of Butler and that area, just because they happen to be outside of, you know, the 2 mile, but you know, they can't really help it that happens to be. I have a lot more sympathy for that than I do. Well, and I'm going to be frank here because that's how I am. I don't want to drive a little bit west because I work east. I mean, you're talking to someone that grew up in the country here. I rode a school bus for many miles the entire time I was in school. So I never had a walkable school. So I'm just, you know, I think that she had a very good point, and the families in Robbins Lane have a very good point. Rezoning you once, yes, maybe twice happens sometimes, but 3 times is really egregious.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, you know, rezoning 3 times is not ideal. We got comments about, well, why can't we go to Talbot? Well, Talbot's over capacity 100%. So it you know, that being outside of that 2 miles is not the only reason. But, you know, when you look at the areas there, it's a tough area for transportation. It's that when you look at each area has advantages and disadvantages for the variables. And that area, transportation for them is easiest to go back west to east on 39th. And we heard that loud and clear. And so I think you see that reflected in F, that we took a lot of that into account from those neighborhoods and that input.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Thank you for your comments. John, if you'll show the screen again so I can be able to see.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. I just took it over from you.
That's okay.
There you go.
If there are no other questions, I have a question for you. Robin Lane, as Mrs. Crosby just stated, but the board has gotten so many emails about the rezoning and where that's going to happen. But I took a look at the neighborhoods over on 39th, Robin Lane, Emerald Woods, Hidden Hills, Summer Creek, Greystone, and Huntington. Because I'm not familiar with all of the neighborhoods on that side of town, but I took a look at those, plus all of the growth over by School I. But my question for the Robin Lane, Emerald Woods, Hidden Hills, those neighborhoods, will those possibly be able to remain then at Meadowbrook in any of those options that
In the majority of the options, they remain at Meadowbrook.
Okay.
Especially now with F. So, you know, there was a lot of focus from them on B and C. A lot of focus on B and C, but the majority of the options don't touch that area.
Okay.
C and D are the two that have.
Sorry, yes, C and D, I'm sorry.
C and D have that impact.
Thank you, Ms. Neal.
And I do have another question because I was in the neighborhood where the Swag Center is located. Those families would go definitely to which area? C, D, E, which one?
We should, if you don't mind, may I share my screen and we'll talk specifically about that area?
And the reason I asked, because I heard you say earlier in your presentation that the major thing that you're trying to do with all of the rezoning is to keep families intact and neighborhoods. And I would say the same for that area. Please share.
Yeah, I will. And I'll respond just before I do that, saying number one is capacity. And we want to make sure we're keeping complexes and neighborhoods. So, you know, the definition of a neighborhood can be this, but let's talk specifically about it. First, I want to show you the current zones. I don't think everybody's aware of how the current zones are drawn there. And if they are, please forgive me. But when you look at the area, I mean, this is essentially what we're calling swag. You have Tower Oaks, Linton Oaks, Majestic Oaks, and then a number of complexes here. So right now, this entire area here goes to Terwilliger. And they're moved across 75 to Terwilliger. This area actually goes to Hidden Oak, which zone is up here. And so that's what we call an enclave. If you're following the growth management area recount, they talk a little bit about enclaves in that on the county side, but this is an enclave. It's separated from Hidden Oak. There's also an enclave here from Childs. So if we're going to call this all an area and refer to it as swag, which I really don't like to do. I mean, these are all distinct families, complexes, and neighborhoods, but we're just going to call this area swag. It is already split up. And so what we're trying to do is get rid of those enclaves. Now, is that the defining goal? No, the defining goal is to get I open, but through I think that we could get rid of these enclaves. And so option A doesn't touch this area, right? It's over here. Also doesn't touch, to your question, Meadowbrook. Option B doesn't touch that area. It does come down in here in Celebration Point, where there's about 177 children that are currently going to Idlewild. Option C now starts to go over there. So let's look at option C. Option C actually takes in, I'm going to turn off the current zones in pink, and option C takes in a large part of this area. Now, we had a comment about Tower Oak being separated. That comment came up. It's a good comment. I kept them in the school they were in. in option C. Option C takes in, and I know this is, I believe this is Cabana Bay. I don't know all the names of the apartment complexes, but for the most part, this gets rid of those enclaves that are there right now. Option D is the same thing, right? Option C and D is just the Terwilliger and Meadowbrook shift. So that's the same thing, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Option E is a little bit smaller, where we send Cabana Bay up West University to Hidden Oak. This portion of the complexes stays. Now, Childs, we remove in option E, we remove the Childs enclave, right? It runs right across there.
Yes.
And so those enclaves are removed. Option F doesn't touch this area, keeps it as it is with the current elementary schools. So right now, I would say the area is split up, and some of these options actually try to, it doesn't address the entire apartment complex situation, but it consolidates a lot more of these neighboring complexes into a school.
Okay. All right.
Does that answer your question, Madam Chair?
That does answer what I needed to know for now. Thank you.
I can stop sharing now and give it back to you. You want?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions? Dr. Paulson, when we started, you said you would have something else. Would you like to share that now? You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you about going north of 39th. If you remember that first meeting, the first thing that jumped out at me was you jumped over everything to get to 39th. You remember that, Mr. Gilroy? And that's the first thing I remember mentioning. So I'm glad that's addressed. I've taught those people that, you know, they had legitimate concerns. And I heard you say you went back towards Littlewood, because I remember saying go east towards Littlewood too. But we haven't seen what you want to do going east. You know, I drove down there all the way to where the suburban animal hospital and all that stuff, and trying to measure different places. But then the next thing is, and Glen Springs, I think Glen Springs could be included in things like to help make it work. But most of the things that I heard from people, I remember I said, oh, about the C grade and everything of Terwilliger. What I heard is people didn't want to be going to school in that area where the mall is. That's what I heard. And that we're waiting for, you mentioned that total rezoning in a couple of years. And I heard, I think, Miss Crosby, we're going to do that again. And that's the people got rezoned how often, which they did say they got rezoned about 5 or 6 times. So all that being said, and I brought this up in a school board meeting, and it costs money to open up a new school. We have been criticized for the number of schools we have in this district, which is legitimate. And we all look at the FADS report we had about 5 years ago. They even criticized us. So I asked if we could get, and maybe it's already happened, I don't know how many you've left in Terwilliger. That's why I asked what schools you mentioned, Mr. Gilreath. But we add another school. And let's give you an example. Marion County has 42,000 students and 50 schools. We have 28,000 students, let's say, at the charter schools, and we have 40 schools. So what we're doing is it's going to cost money in rough times. And it's also, I think it's going to, you know, we have too many schools. I think it hurts the way we educate our children because we can't offer things to them. I asked to get an appraisal for Terwilliger. We got an appraisal probably 10 years ago when we also talked about this. And I wanted to know if we've looked at that, how many students are in Terwilliger in your Plan F? It shouldn't be too many. And can and can we involve other schools like Littlewood, Glen Springs and shift that? And if we're seeing how much we can get for Terwilliger, I think we accomplish not putting our kids in a place where people really don't want to go to school. At least that's what I heard. And also be more efficient with our money and educating our children. And so I'm asking that, and maybe later in the meeting, which I don't have the agenda in front of me. Maybe we're going to, so the question is, how many left for Terwilliger in F? Have you looked?
Terwilliger wouldn't have a change, Board Member Paulson. Terwilliger
much?
would be 621 potentially zoned in F. There's no change to Terwilliger in F.
Well, what I would like, I'm gonna say it again, and I'm only one person. I think we need to look at shifting those students around the same amount of schools we have now. That should be something that should be looked at. And I asked this about a month ago. So I would like to see that, because I'm telling you, it costs money to open up another school. Especially if people talk about tough times. We're opening at 41st school. And we really have more schools than what we have more schools than any per student, any district in the state of Florida. And that's all, and it's in writing. Remember we said, look at the FADS report from a few years ago. And we need to at least consider this and see what Terwilliger is worth. And maybe nobody will agree with me, but I think it's a wise decision financially and for the education of our children. I'm glad we addressed the issue of 39th, because that didn't make any sense. If you remember correctly, I said you can't just look as the crow flies. You have to look at how tough it is for those people to drive, like to Terwilliger. People on like Robin Lane, they pass. They're going away from Meadowbrook. They're passing Hidden Oak to get where they were going. So I thought that was good. But I think legitimately we need to look at not adding another school and see if we could reassign those students, which are already in that many schools right now. I know, and if we go east, like we said, which I think was good, we going east to Littlewood, again, Glen Springs, see if we can handle those students that way. I think financially we'd be better off. I think educationally we'd be better off. And I think looking to the future, we would be better off. So did that come across pretty clear?
Thank you, Dr. Paulson. I'm not sure if Ms. Neal or John will answer directly right now. That might be a decision that will be coming up at a future board meeting, but they can certainly give you numbers. But I would think that question will come up because you brought it up a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure it's gonna be placed again to certainly take a look at it.
I do want to address just a little bit of that. We did look east into Littlewood in option E. That's part of where option E came from, was looking at that. It takes in the southern tip of the current Littlewood zone. And John can probably explain that a little better than I can. So we did go east a bit in option E to look at pulling some of that Littlewood area over. The Terwilliger issue was not something that was given to our group at this point to look at and do numbers around. So we have not looked at numbers, not taking Terwilliger into account.
John, did you have anything to add? I saw another hand in the member.
I was going to say, we did look at Littlewood, and remember Glen Springs is on the list as well as Littlewood for construction in the next few years. And that's something that we're thinking about as well. And I looking at Littlewood, there are a couple of subdivisions that are close to Terwilliger that we looked at, but they don't have a signal. And so they'd be turning left on Newberry in the morning across a median. It would require, in some cases, a U-turn. And so we looked at all areas in Littlewood. And when we think about the ability to get west on 20th up 62nd to Terwilliger, that's why we looked at that portion of Littlewood, Board Member Paulson.
Right, and I think that my answer to that is, that's what's the problem with Terwilliger. It's tough to get to and it's dangerous to get to. And I really, well, I mean, you know, I just think it's something that needs to be looked into financially, educationally, safety, etc.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, Mrs. Clark.
Dr. Paulson and group, we have ordered an appraisal of Terwilliger to just get some information together for the board. You know, the timing of ordering that appraisal, I don't know where we are with that right now. I would have to defer that to facilities. And so we have ordered that appraisal to provide that information. But the other piece of that is the timing surrounding all of this right now of getting through the rule-making process, which zoning falls under, and the timeline that John shared at the very beginning of the meeting with the timing and making sure we're budgeting for that school, making sure that we're staffing that school, making sure we have the kids somewhere, you know, by February, March is critical. So timing is really of the essence if we were going to make such a major move as that. So we have ordered the appraisal. I think too, there's some other information that staff is working on gathering of some options of how we could potentially do that with Terwilliger and what does that look like from a more district-wide approach. Because if we were to do something like that with Terwilliger, there's all the options that have been shared for rezoning. You've got some that are that cookie cutter approach they've talked about, and others that involve way more neighborhoods, you know, 8 or 9 schools worth of students that would be impacted. And so there's a concern of if we are going to look at if the board, you know, wants the district to look at a district-wide rezoning in 2 or 3 years, do you move somebody now and then move them again in 3 years? And I believe Ms. Crosby mentioned that of, you know, moving kids multiple times, and especially in elementary school, you could have students at 3 different schools over a 6-year time period if you were to touch them multiple times in rezoning. So that may be as we move forward, if the board wants to tackle something like that, then we would have to look at, do we need to do something cookie cutter right now for the opening of School I that doesn't touch as many neighborhoods, with the anticipation that in 2 or 3 years, does this Terwilliger option, because as we all know, it's right next to the mall. That is not necessarily the safest place for students to be in school anymore. 30 years ago, it was a great place for a school. But do we look at that towards the future moving forward? Because the concern is looking at Terwilliger and the overcrowding of the schools that we have right now that are near Terwilliger. Right now, unless something has changed, we don't have room for another portable at Littlewood. Even if we put more students here, we don't have the space for a portable. And those students will be moving into a transition school in not too many years because of the extensive work that will be going on at Littlewood. So there's some options there that we can look at that would impact potentially on a more district-wide basis if the board wants to move towards a look at a district-wide rezoning. But I think that's got to drive whatever the decision is of what the rezoning looks like, because that is a key factor in that. We can certainly look at where we could put Terwilliger kids right now, but there's not a lot of room around them. So does that mean then we send Terwilliger kids much farther away from their current school when they really haven't been a part of the conversation? Or do we save that for a more comprehensive rezoning? So I think that's going to be a big part of that conversation. You know, I'm hopeful that if that's the direction the board wants to move, that the appraisal will come back strong. You know, the appraisal 10 years ago was fairly strong, as I recall, and that you would have an interested buyer for that property that could help cover that cost, maybe cover renovations at other schools. If we know that that's going to close, if we were to not use that site for Terwilliger and close it, we could make adjustments to the plans for other schools in order to increase the capacity a little bit at some of those schools surrounding them, like a Littlewood or a Parker or something like that. So there's a lot more dominoes that could potentially, you know, go any number of directions with that. So there's an awful lot to consider.
Mrs. Clark, thank you so much for all of those comments. I did see one final hand. I want to be very cognizant of people's time. It is 4:30, 4:33 as a matter of fact. Coach Bauer, I thought I saw his hand earlier, but his video is off. I'm not sure if he was raising his hand. He's muted as well. So I'm going to bypass him then, but I did see his hand during Dr. Paulson's comments, but maybe he has changed his mind. Mrs. Neal, you have already addressed the input forms.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And so if we're all clear, then at 4:34, I will deem this DAC meeting adjourned. But before we do that, we need to make sure we have the next date. Ms. Neal?
I do want to add, in your information that Ms. Johnson sent you, there was a link to an input form for this specific group to complete based on today's conversation, seeing the new F option, that citizen input option. We do ask that all of you complete that input form so that we can give the board and Mrs. Clark the input of this group and being able to help us to maybe define those as well. So that DAC rezoning input form, we're asking to have back by the end of the day on Monday. So we have time to gather that together to get out in the packets for board members before the December 1st workshop. We want to make sure you have the DAC input forms for that meeting. So we do ask for those to be completed and submitted by the end of the business day on Monday, the 23rd of November. If you need that link again, I'll ask Ms. Johnson to just resend that out to everyone with a reminder of that deadline. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Neal. All right, with that, thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to your information by Monday, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Dr. McNeely.
Oh, John, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, all right.
Bye.
Bye.
I said thank you.